Overcoming habitual limitations. In the following stories, Erickson explains two elements that are very important in extending limits. The first is establishing a mental set that is broader or less limited than the preceding one. The second is to approach the task without focusing on the limits, but focusing on the task itself. Golf, for example. On every hole you think it is the first. In other words, the sense of an entire context, including the number of the hole, the previous scores, and so on, is eliminated while one focuses on each stroke, each shot. The question of limits, then, does not arise. That is determined later when one looks back at the score. If you want to become creative or think creatively, you must practice what has been called divergent thinking, in contrast to convergent thinking, which adults tend to adopt as they become more and more restrictive in their behavior. In convergent thinking, a number of stories or a number of themes converge into one. In divergent thinking, one idea moves out into many different directions, like the branching of a tree. A book that I have found helpful in stimulating imagination and perhaps increasing creativity is Mental Jogging by Rate J. Deitzman. It includes 365 mental exercises along the lines of name 7 ways to avoid spilling coffee while driving. These tales are typical for those that Erickson used to stretch people's mind. Stones and quantum mechanics. All of you have seen my stones that were polished 200 million years ago. My 15-year-old grandson said, "These stones were polished 200 million years ago. That eliminates man. I ought to know how they were polished. You wouldn't show me a water-polished stone. I have lived in Okinawa. I have seen water-polished stones, and I have been around volcanoes. It wouldn't be that. You are showing me something unexpected from 200 million years ago. I know you are showing me something that I would know about. I have got to stop thinking about sand and water and ice and man." While he was cogitating about that, I said, "I have another riddle to ask you. What does this refer to?" "How I want a drink, alcoholic of course, after the heavy chapters involving quantum mechanics." He said, "I don't get it. I don't know what quantum mechanics are." I said, "You don't need to know. I'll give you the illiterate answer. Drive 2 fence posts into the ground 2 feet apart. Lay across the fence posts a board just long enough to overlap the posts by an inch, and you get the illiterate answer." It took Erickson's grandson a few minutes before he was able to exclaim, "That's the first time I've ever thought of it that way." It may take most readers even longer to visualize the illiterate answer, or to draw 2 vertical lines with a horizontal line above them, P, the symbol for pi. Erickson gives another hint, one that would probably be helpful only for medical students and doctors of medicine. He says, all doctors know the mnemonic for the cranial nerves. An old Olympus towering tops a Finn and German vent some hops. Thus, instead of simply saying the riddle is a mnemonic, Erickson gives an example of another mnemonic, leaving it for the reader to make his own connections. Mnemonic. The stones that Erickson had thrown his grandson came from the gizzard of a dinosaur. They were polished as the dinosaurs digest his food. Thus, the grandson was correct in realizing that he had to think about something other than sand, water, ice, or man as the source of the polishing. He had to go outside his usual ways of thinking in order to solve the problem. Erickson is telling his readers and listeners that they must go outside of their usual ways of thinking. The riddle about the stones is not related to the other one, except that they are both riddles. If the reader has not yet made the connection, he might try counting the number of letters in each word of "How I Want a Drink." 3, 1, 4, 1, 5. That's right. Pi is 3.1415926535897 and so on. Going from room to room. I asked the student, how do you get from this room into that room? He answered, first you stand up, then you take a step. I stopped him and said, name all the possible ways you can get from this room into that room. He said, you can go by running, by walking, you can by jumping, you can go by hopping, by somersaulting, you can go out the door, you go outside the house, come in another door and into the room, or you could climb a window if you want to. I said, you said you would be inclusive, but you made an omission, which is a major omission. I usually illustrate first by saying, if I want to get into that room from this room, I would go out the door, take a taxi to the airport, buy a ticket to Chicago, New York, London, Rome, Athens, Hong Kong, Honolulu, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, Phoenix, come back by limousine and go in the backyard. And then through the back gate into the back door and into that room. And you thought only of forward movement. You didn't think of going in backwards, did you? And you didn't think of crawling in. The student added, or of sliding on my stomach either. We do limit ourselves so terribly in all our thinking. I win Olympic championships all the time. I asked Erickson about a patient of mine who is a concert pianist. He was fearful that he would freeze at the keyboard and that he would be unable to play of arthritis in his hands. Erickson's response was as follows. A pianist, no matter how bad his hands get, knows music, and he knows how to compose. And that's one thing he should never forget. A hand may get useless, but he can compose, and compose even better. Out of a wheelchair, I win Olympic championships all the time. Donald Lawrence and the gold medal. Donald Lawrence had been practicing the shot put for a whole year. The coach at the high school had voluntarily coached him without charge for a whole year every night. Donald was 6 feet 6 inches, 260 pounds, and didn't have an ounce of fat on him. And the coach had a great ambition to get a national high school record for the shot put. At the end of the year, the high school contest was 2 weeks away, and Donald could only put the shot 58 feet far short of the record. His father was interested. He brought Donald in to see me. I told Donald to sit down and go into the trance. I told him to levitate his hand and to learn to feel his muscles all over, and then to come in the next time, go into the trance and listen to me. I asked him if he knew that a mile used to be 4 minutes long, and that Roger Bannister had broken the record after the record had stood for many, many years. I asked him if he knew how Bannister done this. I said, well, Bannister, who was acquainted with sports of all kinds, realized that you can win a ski run by 100th of a second, by 10th of a second, and then he began to realize that a 4-minute mile would be 240 seconds. If he could run it in 239 and 5/10 of a second, he would break the 4-minute mile. Having thought that through, he broke the 4-minute mile record. And I said, you have already thrown the shot 58 feet. And Donald, tell me honestly, do you think you know the difference between 58 feet and 58 feet and 1/16th of an inch? He said, no, of course not. I said 58 feet and 58 feet and 1/8 of an inch. He said no. And I brought it up to 58 feet and 59 feet. And he could not tell the difference. He had a couple more sessions in which I slowly enlarged the possibility. And 2 weeks after, he set a national high school record. The summer he came in and said, I am going to the Olympics. I want some advice. I said, the Olympic record for the shot put is just under 62 feet. You're just an 18-year-old kid. It would be all right if you bring home the bronze medal. And don't bring home the silver or the gold, because then you will be competing against yourself. Let Perry and O'Brien take the gold and silver. Perry and O'Brien did, and Donald came home with the bronze medal. Then the Olympics were in Mexico City. Donald came in and said, I'm going to Mexico City. I said, you are 4 years older now, Donald. It would be all right if you take the gold medal. And he came home with the gold medal. He was going to Tokyo and asked, what should I do in Tokyo? I said, athletic accomplishments require time for maturing. Take the gold medal again. He came home with it and he entered college to study dentistry. There he found out that he was eligible for 2 meets that he wanted to enter. He came in and said, the college meet is coming up, it's official. What shall I do about this short putt? I said, Donald, people always restrict themselves. In the short putt in the Olympics, they restricted themselves for years and years to less than 62 feet. Frankly, I don't know how far a shot can be put. I am certain it can be put 62 feet. I even wonder if it can be put 70 feet. So why don't you reach a record mark somewhere between 62 feet and 70 feet? I think he placed it 65 feet 6 inches. The next time he came in and asked, now what do I do? I said, Donald, you showed that the long-time Olympic record was very wrong by getting it up to 65 feet. And that's just the first try. Next time, see how close you can get it to 70 feet. Donald said, all right. He placed it 68 feet 10 inches. I told the coach at Texas A&M all about Donald Lawrence, how I trained him. The coach listened very carefully and said, I'm training Masterson for the shot put, When the coach told Masterson how I had trained Donald Lawrence, Masterson said, if that's the way Erickson trained Donald Lawrence to set a record, I'm going to see how much farther I can put it than Donald Lawrence. He placed it 70 feet. I think it is up to 70 feet and 4 inches now. Erickson then switches to golf. In golf, actually, you hit the first hole and reach the second hole in a correct number of shots. Then the question arises, can you do as well on the third hole? Therefore, on every hole, you think it's the first. You let the caddy keep count of which hole. One contestant came to me and said, I shoot in the low 70s, and I want to win the state championship before I go into professional golfing. I want to win the amateur championship of Arizona. But every tournament I enter, I wind up with a score in the 90s. Playing alone, I can get down to the low 70s. I put him into a trance and told him, you will play only the first hole. That's all you will remember, and you will be alone on the golf course. He played in the next state tournament. After the 18th hole, he walked toward another hole, and somebody stopped him and told him, you've played the 18th hole. And he said, no, I just played the first hole. Then he said, where did all these people come from? We can note the way Erickson uses truisms to give suggestions. You're 4 years older now, Donald. It would be all right if you take the gold medal. The first statement is true, the second part of the statement could be true. By juxtaposing them, Erickson equates one with one another. By suggesting to Donald that he first bring home the bronze medal, he is demonstrating an inordinate amount of control. A pinpoint control. This kind of control is even better than winning first place. When 4 years later Erickson suggests that it is all right for Donald to get the gold medal, this had been practiced on previous demonstrations of control. Finally, it is important with this story, more than with some of the others, to remember that Donald Lawrence is a real person and that he actually has won Olympic championships. Only his name is disguised, along with minor facts. The kind of beneficial effect was neither purely theoretical nor was it a fantasy of Erickson's. Donald was able to make his progress step by step. Erickson started by reminding him of something you already knew. Roger Bannister had broken the record for the 4-minute mile. How did Bannister do it? By changing his way of thinking. He changed the 4 minutes to 240 seconds, and then he could deal with seconds instead of minutes. Erickson's strategy was then to get Donald to think about things in a different way. Once he changed his thinking, like Roger Bannister, he was able to overcome the psychological block. Erickson also makes a small change. The difference between 58 feet and 58 feet and 1/16 of an inch. He makes a small change and then he builds upon that change. Each problem carries a past and a future. That Erickson realizes is that if you eliminate the past and change the future, you've changed 2/3 of the problem. Therefore, if you think about each hole as being the first, there is no anxiety from the past. You have eliminated the past and you can change the future because the future can only be one of positive expectancy. These two tales have been very helpful to me when I convey the idea to patients that the answer to dependence upon another person is to extend one's own capabilities and limits. This is much more meaningful than simply tell them that they must learn to stand on their own feet, which is what everybody else has been telling them. All right, let's mark something here in the beginning. We had a little hint for what's happening in this chapter. And I think we have to mark here divergent thinking in contrast to convergent thinking, which adults tend to adopt as they become more and more restrictive in their behavior. In convergent thinking, a number of stories or a number of themes converge into one. In divergent thinking, one idea moves out into many different directions, like the branching of the tree. All right. Where are we? Just here. Training the US rifle team to beat the Russians. The coach of the advanced marksmanship team of the army got to reading about hypnosis and decided that hypnosis could help his team beat the Russians. The teams were training in Georgia. They had been in a shoot in San Francisco, and they stopped in Phoenix. The coach brought the team in to see me and asked me if I could train this team to beat the Russians in the international shoot. I explained to him, I've shot a rifle twice when I was a teenager. I know the muzzle end and the shock end, and that's all I know about a rifle. Now these riflemen know all they need to know about a gun. I'm a medical man. I know what I need to know about a body. I'll train your team. They already have the rifle knowledge, and I have the medical knowledge. The commandant was infuriated that a civilian was going to train the rifle team, that he added 2 men who had been trying for 2 years to make the rifle team. I don't know what the qualifications were for the rifle team, but it was a score in the 60s. Those 2 men had been devoting all their spare time to train and scored in the low 40s. In other words, they couldn't make the team. One of the first things I told the man after I found that in the contest you shoot 40 rounds in succession was, I know the first bullseye is easy. The question is, can you do it twice? Can you do it 11 times after 10 successive bullseyes? I've done it 19 times. You've done it 19 times. Will you make it the 20th time? The tension is growing with each successful shot. You've made it 29 times. Can you make it 30 times? You've made it 35 times. 36? 37? 38? Breathlessly. 39? Can I possibly make it 40 times? The next thing I did was to call in a good hypnotic subject. I told the subject, after you awaken, you're going to be offered a cigarette. You'll want to smoke it, and you'll gladly accept it. You will put it into your mouth, and you'll absent-mindedly drop it and take a second cigarette, not remembering you've had the first cigarette. And so he accepted 169 cigarettes. Then they knew that they could. Then they knew that they too could forget. If he could forget 169 cigarettes, then they could forget each one of the 40 shots. Then I told them, now you fit the sole of your feet on the ground so that the sole of your feet feels comfortable. Then you make sure your ankle's comfortable, your calf is comfortable, your knee, your hip joint, your trunk, your left arm, your finger on the trigger. The rifle stock against your shoulder, you get just exactly the right feeling. And then you wave the rifle sight up and down across the target and back and forth. And at the right moment, you squeeze the trigger. and they beat the Russians for the first time at Moscow, and the two men the commandant who had thrown in also placed. While the preceding tale illustrates the establishment of a broader or less limited mental set, this tale illustrates the principle of focusing on the task itself. This was accomplished not only by the men's forgetting all preceding shots, but also by their focusing attention on sensations in the body in the present. A flash of color. A patient came to me and said, "I've lived in Phoenix for the past 15 years and I have hated every moment of those 15 years. My husband has offered me a vacation in Flagstaff. I hate Phoenix so much, but I refuse to go to Flagstaff. I prefer to stay in Phoenix and to hate being in Phoenix." So I told her while she was in trance that she would be curious about hating Phoenix and about why she punished herself so much. That should be a very big curiosity. And there is another thing to be curious about and very, very curious about. If you go to Flagstaff for a week, you will see very unexpectedly a flash of color. As long as she had a big curiosity about hating Phoenix, she could develop an equally large curiosity just as compelling to find out what the flash of color would be in Flagstaff. She went to Flagstaff for a week, just stayed a month. What flash of color did she see? I had none in mind. I just wanted her to be curious, and when she saw that flash of color, she was so elated that she remained a whole month in Flagstaff. That flash of color was a red-headed woodpecker flying past an evergreen tree. This woman usually spends the summer in Flagstaff now, but she also has gone to the East Coast to see the color there. She has gone to Tuscan to see the flash of color. She has gone to New York to see a flash of color. She has gone to Europe to see a flash of color. And my statement that she would see a flash of color was based only upon the fact that you have to see a lot of things that ordinarily you don't see. And I wanted her to keep looking, and she would find something to translate into my words. This set of instruction, which was included in a hypnotic induction, was used to help the listener overcome habitual limitations. The overt suggestions and permission for the overcoming of these limitations are obvious. I have italicized certain words which Erickson marked by emphasizing them with a change of tone. These words, such as "keep looking," are obvious instructions presented in an embedded way to encourage looking into one's own unconscious repertory. Very often after one of these words was marked, he paused, sometimes for as long as 3 or 4 minutes, to allow time for this inner work to take place. At the same time, he includes post-hypnotic suggestions, which would lead to a dream, perhaps a week later. Bandler and Grinder might point out Erickson's switches of representational systems in this story. The patient begins kinesthetically by stating that she prefers to stay in Phoenix and to hate being in Phoenix. Erickson changes her representational system to a visual one, using as a bridge her curiosity. He dislodges her from her hate to curiosity, which decreases the hate. Then he moves the curiosity to something visual in the way he goes stepwise from the kinesthetic to the visual. Even though Erickson himself could not appreciate color, he was colorblind. He used color just as he used sound and poetry, which he also could not appreciate because he was tone deaf and lacked a sense of rhythm, because he knew that other people could appreciate these elements. Jeffrey Zeig has pointed out that by moving a patient beyond a limitation that he himself has, Erickson is encouraging the patient to leave it in the dust. This is a nice way of emphasize individual differences. Also, if that particular patient is a one-up type of person, it gives him an opportunity to be even more one-up. He can have something that even Erickson can't. Walking on glare ice. During the war, I worked at the induction board in Detroit. One day, as I was going to the induction board, I saw a veteran who had returned with an artificial leg, looking at some glare ice and eyeing it suspiciously because he knew that he was likely to fall on glare ice. "That's very smooth ice," I told him. "Stand where you are. I'll come over and teach you how to walk on glare ice." He could see that I had a limp, so he knew I must be talking about what he knew. He watched me walk across that glare ice and asked, "How did you do it?" I said, "I won't tell you. I'll teach you. Now you just keep your eyes totally shut." And I turned him around and walked him back and forth on the ice-free sidewalk. I kept walking him back and forth over longer distances and then shorter and shorter distances until finally I noticed his utter confusion. Finally, I got him clear across the other side of the glare ice. I said, "Open your eyes." He said, "Where's the glare ice?" I said, "It's behind you." He said, "How did I get over there?" I said, "Now you can understand. You walked as if the cement was bare. When you try to walk on ice the usual tendency is to tense your muscles, preparing for a fall. You get a mental set, and you slip that way. If you put the weight on your legs down straight, the way you would on dry cement, you wouldn't slip. The slide comes because you don't put down your full weight and because you tense yourself. It took me a long time to find that out. Did you ever walk upstairs one step too many? What an awful jolt it is. Walk downstairs one too many? You can break your leg, and yet you are totally unaware of that set. Here Erickson demonstrates his classical method of helping a person out of a fixed mental set. The first step is to confuse the subject. The second step during this confused period is to lead the subject over the obstacle so that the subject has an experience of success. Of course, in this case, the experience of success occurred when the subject failed to respond with his usual tightening, with his usual mental set. The old set is replaced with a new one. The patient believes he can walk across glare ice. He now approaches new slippery situations without carrying over the fear associated with previous falls. Sometimes it is important for the patient to not use things he knows or perceptions that he ordinarily would use. For this reason, Erickson has the man close his eyes. Once the man had stopped seeing, he could accomplish the task. Seeing had previously caused him to have a kinesthetic reaction that caused him to adopt the wrong set. Erickson liked to illustrate hypnotic concentrations by asking people, if I were to put a board 1 foot wide and 50 feet long on the floor, would you have any difficulty walking along it? Of course, the answer would be no. He would then add, what would be your reaction if I were to put the same board 1 foot wide and 50 feet long between 2 buildings, reaching across from the 50th floor of one of the 50th floor of the other? Again, in this example, the visual sense is associated with a kinesthetic set that would lead most people to lose their sense of security. To succeed in this task, or walking a tightrope, it may be important to not use something you have, that is your visual sense and your imagination. Beautiful. The Tarahumara Indians. The Tarahumara Indians of southwestern Chihuahua are the ones who can run 100 miles. The pressure doesn't go up and their heartbeat doesn't change. Some entrepreneur took some 100-mile runners to the Olympics. 1928 in Amsterdam. They didn't even place because they thought 25 miles was when you warmed up. It had been explained to them that their run was 25 miles long. I sometimes think about that story when I'm having difficulty getting into a task. When I'm writing, repairing something around the house, frustrated by difficulties, or literally breathless from jogging. The phrase will come into my head, I'm just warming up now. I usually find more energy available after this. Dry beds. As in Sufi tales or Zen stories, the recipient of the knowledge of the healer must be in a state of readiness to receive. In many of those stories, the supplicant comes to the master, but is refused entry until the vehicle is ready to receive the richness of the teaching. Erickson often accomplishes this preparation by causing the listener or the patient to wait a long time before he delivers his punchline. For example, when he presented the next tale to a group of students, he spent about 1/2 hour in building up to the final prescription. Some of his time was spent in outlining the background history. Some was spent in asking the listeners how they would treat such a patient. Some time was spent in telling other stories not directly related to the problem. He repeated such phrases as, there is something that you know but don't know that you know. When you know what it is that you don't know you know, then you will be able to have a permanently dry bed. This type of puzzling and yet intriguing statement causes the listener to do what Ernest Rossi called an inner search. The listener is thus already beginning to search inside himself for resources that may help in the healing process. When we consider one of Erickson's induction technique, the waiting technique, the same principle applies. The patient literally is left begging for more. Then he is ready to receive. A mother brought her 11-year-old daughter in to see me. As soon as I heard about her bedwetting, I sent the mother out of the room with the belief that the girl could tell me her story. The girl told me that she had a bladder infection in very early infancy, that she was treated by a urologist, and that the infection had persisted for 5 or 6 years, maybe longer. She had been cystoscoped regularly hundreds of times, and eventually the focus of the infection was found in one kidney. That had been removed, and she had been free of infections for about 4 years. She had been cystoscoped so many hundreds of times, and her bladder and sphincter were so stretched that she wet the bed every night as soon as her bladder relaxed in her sleep. During the day, she could forcibly control her bladder unless she loved. The relaxation that goes with love caused her to wet her pants. Her parents thought that since she had had her kidney removed and had been free of the infection for several years, she ought to learn to control herself. She had 3 younger sisters who called her bad names and ridiculed her. All of the mothers knew that she wet her bed, and all the school children, 2,000 or 3,000 of them, knew that she was a bedwetter. And she wet her pants when she laughed, and she was the butt of much ridicule. She was very tall, very pretty, blonde, with long hair that reached down to her waist. She was really a very charming girl. She was ostracized, ridiculed. More was demanded of her than she could produce. She had to endure the pity of neighbors and the ridicule of her sisters and the school children. She couldn't go to slumber parties and spend the night with relatives because of her bedwetting. I asked her if she had seen any other doctors. She said that she had seen a lot of them, had swallowed a barrel full of pills and a barrel full of medicine, and nothing helped. I told her that I was like all the other doctors. I couldn't help her either. But you already know something, but you don't know that you know it. And as soon as you find out what it is that you already know and don't know that you know, you can begin having a dry bed. Then I told her, I am going to ask you a very simple question, and I want a very simple answer. Now here's the question. If you were sitting in the bathroom, urinating, and a strange man poked his head in the doorway, what would you do? I'd freeze. That's right, you'd freeze and stop urinating. Now you know what you already knew, but didn't know that you already knew it. Namely, that you can stop urinating at any time for any stimulus you choose. You really don't need a strange man poking his head in the bathroom. Just the idea of it is enough. You will stop, you will freeze, and when he goes away, you will start urinating. Now, having a dry bed is a very difficult job. You might have your first dry bed in 2 weeks, and there has to be a lot of practice, starting and stopping. Some days you may forget to practice starting and stopping. That's all right. Your body will be good to you. It will always give you further opportunities. And some days you may be too busy to practice starting and stopping, but that's all right. Your body will always give you opportunities to start and stop. It would surprise me very much if you had a permanently dry bed within 3 months. It would also surprise me if you didn't have a permanently dry bed within 6 months. And the first dry bed will be much easier than 2 dry beds in succession, and 3 dry beds in succession is much harder, and 4 dry beds in succession is still harder. After that, it gets easier. You can have 5, 6, 7, a whole week of dry beds, and then you can know that you can have 1 week of dry beds and another week of dry beds. I took my time with this girl. I had nothing else to do. I spent an hour and a half with her and dismissed her. After 2 weeks later, she brought in this present for me. The first present she had ever given, with the knowledge that she had had a dry bed. It was a knitted purple cow. I value that present. And 6 months later, she was staying overnight at friends' relatives, at slumber parties, in a hotel, because it is the patient who does the therapy. I didn't think it was the family that needed therapy, even though the parents were impatient. The sisters called her bad names, the school children ridiculed her. My feeling was that her parents would have to adjust to her dry beds. So her sister and the school children and the neighbors. In fact, I saw no other course for them. I didn't think it was necessary to explain anything to the father, the mother, the sisters, or anybody else. I had told her what she already knew, but didn't know that she knew. And all of you have grown up with the idea that when you empty your bladder, you're empty it all the way. And you assume that the important thing is that all of you have had the experience of being interrupted and shutting off a stream of urine very suddenly. Everybody has that experience, and she had forgotten it. And all I did was remember her of something she said she knew, but didn't know she knew it. In other words, in doing therapy, you regard your patient as an individual, and no matter how much of a problem her bedwetting was to her parents, her sisters, neighbors, and school children, it was primarily her problem, and all she needed to know was something she already knew, and the therapy for all the others was letting them make their own adjustments. Psychotherapy should be an orientation to the patient and an orientation to the primary problem itself. And remember this, that all of us have our individual language, and that when you listen to a patient, you should listen knowing that he is speaking in an alien language, and that you should not try to understand in terms of your language. Understand the patient in his language. This is one of my favorite Erickson tales, because perhaps Erickson would almost always introduce it with a comment such as, "You will be especially interested in this story," he said. I puzzled for a long time before I could find this message to me, and finally was able to extract 2 main ones. The first is that you can learn control of your thoughts, of working energies, and of symptoms, such as anxiety. I must do this, however, not by willpower, but by discovering which stimuli are necessary to induce me to start and stop. Then I must take the opportunities to practice starting and stopping. The second message is that all of you have grown up with the idea that when you empty your bladder, you empty it all the way. In the version of this tale that was published in a teaching seminar with Milton Erickson, edited by Jeffrey Zeig, Erickson added some extra sentences that make this second point even clearer. All she needed to know was she could stop her urination at any time with the right stimulus, and we have grown up thinking that we have to finish. That isn't true, that we must continue until we are finished. I have found this attitude to be a great help in accomplishing such tasks as writing. The coercive feeling that we must finish can easily block spontaneity and creativity. A far more effective way of getting something done is by starting and stopping according to one's inner rhythm. I have found the story to be effective in helping patients overcome blockages such as writer's block. Bolo tie. All our life we learn to place limits on so many things. I can think of Bill Foles, a cool TV newsman. On a trip to Chicago, he went to a restaurant where the head waiter informed him that he would have to wear a tie, and not that bolo tie that Bill was wearing. Bill asked the head waiter, "What did you pay for your tie?" The waiter said very proudly, $25. And Bill said, "My tie cost $200. The waiter didn't know what to think, and Bill Foles walked into the restaurant and took a seat where he chose to sit. While the waiter tried to give that some thought, the odd-looking thing that Bill Foles had on a $200 tie, while his was only $25 one. So have a dream. And every time you dream, you have the right and the privilege of redreaming that dream with another cast of characters. And in that way you can discover many things you've been trained not to know. Your teachers a long time ago told you, "Look at me when you're speaking to me. Look at me when I'm speaking to you." And you learned, don't do this and don't do that. Wear the right clothes, the right shoes. Tie your shoestrings right. So much of your learning is based upon limited instructions that bar us from our own development, our own understanding, and we get into patterns of being limited. I taught my sons how to hoe a potato patch by making designs, and all the time they are making designs with their hoes and hoeing the potato patch, they are wondering what their last design will be. So my sons learned to hoe a potato patch by hoeing triangles and more triangles, and on their own they discovered that they could hoe circles and numbers and letters. And it is wonderful to have a night's sleep, a sound and restful sleep, and not find out until next week that you have dreamed that night. You didn't know about that dream until a week later. The comments that Erickson made after the tale of the bolo tie might seem to be irrelevant. Actually, they are this way of repeating and driving home the main points of the tale. The first point is that we are limited in our patterns of understanding and action. Wear the right clothes. So much of our learning is based upon limited instructions. The second point is that we can prepare our limited and limiting instructions replace them with new patterns of our own devising, circles and numbers and letters. Finally, Erickson frames his comments with the suggestion that the listener should discover new patterns in a dream. He should trust his unconscious mind to devise novel ways of overcoming habitual limitations. Sin. A young woman came to see me. She was brought up to believe that theaters are places where young girls are seduced and places of sin. She would not go into a drugstore because she sold tobacco there, and the Lord might strike her to the ground if she was in a place that dispersed tobacco. And she wouldn't drink wine or cider or any alcoholic beverages, because if she did, God would strike her dead. God would strike her dead if she went to the theater. He'd strike her dead if she smoked a cigarette. I inquired about her employment, and she worked for a doctor who belonged to the church. He paid her $100 a month. The average salary that time was $270 a month. She had worked for him for 10 years, and she was still getting just $100 a month. And her typewriting speed was no higher than 25 words a minute. She lived at home with her parents, who guaranteed their daughter guarded her very carefully against sin. It took her an hour to get to work, 8 hours of work, sometimes overtime without pay. It took her another hour to get home, and she worked 6 days a week. She went to church on Sunday all day long. It was a very rigid and limited family. When the girl left my office after the first interview, my wife, who seldom comments on patients, said, "Who was that thing that the cat dragged in?" I said, "Just a patient of mine." So I talked to the girl, and I persuaded her that life is full of pitfalls and death comes with all, and if it was God's plan for her to die at a certain time, I was certain that she would not die of smoking cigarettes unless God was ready to receive her. I got her to smoke a cigarette. She coughed a lot, and God did not strike her dead. He really didn't. That surprised her. Then I suggested that she go to the theater. It took a couple of weeks to build up her courage. She told me very earnestly, "God will strike me dead if I go to a house of sin." I told her that if God did not strike her dead, it would be because it was not her time to die, and that I had great doubts about it being her time to die. Would she please come and tell what movie she had seen? She returned after seeing The Lady and the Tramp. I didn't pick out that movie. She said the church must be wrong. There wasn't a thing bad in that movie. There weren't any corrupting men despoiling young girls. I think the movie was entertaining. I said, I think the church has given you a false idea about movies. I don't think the church did it intentionally. I think the church did it out of ignorance. And she found other movies interesting, especially musicals. Then one day I told her, I think you've improved enough to take a drink of whiskey. She said, God will surely strike me dead. I said, I have doubts about that. He didn't strike you dead when you went to the theater or when you smoked a cigarette. Let's see. See if he strikes you dead if you drink a drink of whiskey. She took a drink of whiskey and waited, and God didn't strike her dead. Then she said, I think I've got to make some changes in my life. I think I had better move out of my parents' home and get my apartment for myself. I said, and you need to get a better job. You need to learn how to type and move into an apartment of your own. Of course, you can afford it. So feel free to ask your parents to pay you can't afford it, so ask your parents and do your own work, cooking, and rent a typewriter. As soon as you awaken in the morning, you rush to the typewriter, the first thing, and type, "This is a beautiful day in June." Then you go to the bathroom, brush your teeth, and type another brief sentence, typing full speed for each sentence. Make each sentence very short, then start dressing. Halfway through dressing, type another sentence. When you finish dressing, type another short sentence. Start getting your breakfast ready and type another short sentence. Sit down to eat, and halfway through breakfast, get up and type another short sentence, always typing at top speed. You can do that interrupted practice always at full speed, and you will learn to type at a much more rapid rate. In 3 months' time, she was up to a speed of 80 words a minute. As for her cooking, she said, I thought I'd make some rice, and I figured I could heat a cup of rice. I put it in a pan with water. Then I had to get another pan because the cup of rice filled that big pan. And I had to get a couple of other pans. I didn't know rice swelled like that. I said, there's a lot of things to learn about cooking. I had her bake some beans. She measured that cup of beans very carefully, and they swelled into an enormous quantity. She eventually became a good cook, and she resigned from her church and told her parents, I'll come to visit you now and then. I've got a job now. It's $270 a month, and I only have to walk 8 blocks to get to my job. Then she came to me, and about this time, Mrs. Erickson said to me, Milton, do you specialize in beautiful blondes? I said the cat dragged in the last one because that girl turned out to be very pretty. She took music lessons and enjoyed her work. Then she came to me after some months and said, Dr. Erickson, I want to get drunk and I want to know how to do it. I said the best way of getting drunk is to give a promise that you will not use the telephone, that you will lock your door and not unlock it, and that you will remain in your apartment. Get a bottle of wine and enjoy drinking it, zip by zip, until you have got the entire bottle drunk. She came to me within the next few days and said, I'm glad you made me promise not to use my telephone because I wanted to call up my friends and invite them to come over and get drunk with me. And that would have been terrible. I wanted to go out into the street and sing, and I promised that I would lock the door and wouldn't unlock it. I'm so glad you made me promise. You know, getting drunk was fun, but I had a bad headache in the morning. I don't think I want to get drunk again. I said, for the joy of getting drunk, you have to pay a bill, and that is a headache, a hangover. And you are at the liberty to have as many hangovers as you want. She said, I don't want any more hangovers. She later got married. Now I've lost track of her. I think it's very important to take the patient seriously and meet his wishes, not to exercise cold, hard judgment, and recognize the people need to learn things, that you really aren't competent to teach them all the things they need, that they can learn a lot of their own, and that she certainly did. And they are usually marvelously polite in a trance. Get them to break prohibitions. This is one of Erickson's prime rules for treating many types of symptom complexes, including, of course, phobias and inhibitory states. First, in the outlining of the history, Erickson is careful to elicit signs of limitations, rigidities, narrow sets. Then, using the patient's own beliefs, he will set out getting them to break the prohibitions. Here, Erickson presents a situation of a young woman who is extremely limited. Her limitations are seen as coming from her rigid church and family teachings. Of course, they could just as easily come from inner strict structures as prime method of helping her to break her prohibitions, to extend her world experiences, and to build her ability to live independently and self-sufficiently, is to induce her to put herself into new situations. In these new situations, she learns from her own experience, not from the dictates of others, what her limitations actually are. She also learns something about dealing with materials such as rice. Of course, Erickson typically, in talking about the expansion of the rice and the beans, seeds universal ideas about expansion. In fact, the whole story can be seen as illustrating the expansion of a very small personality, such as much larger one. Her income expands from $100 per month to $270 per month. Her personality blooms and her looks manifest this, so that she changes from spending that the cat dragged into a beautiful blonde. And the patient does find out her own limitations from experience. For example, she learns from the experience of having a hangover. Finally, Erickson gives a hint as to how he gets people to do things they would not ordinarily consider doing. He explains they are usually marvelously polite in a trance. In putting emphasis on impulses and feeling over intellect and concepts, Erickson is merely trying to correct the imbalances that develops in most people. As he told me once, in a child, the body tries to keep up with the feet. In an adult, the feet try to keep up with the body and head. Reduce, gain, reduce. A woman came to see me and she said, I weigh 180 pounds. I've dieted successfully under doctor's orders hundreds of times and I want to weigh 130 pounds. Every time I get to 130 pounds, I rush into the kitchen to celebrate my success. I put it back on right away. Now I weigh 180. Can you hypnotize me to help me reduce to 130 pounds? I'm back to 180 for the 100th time. I told her yes, I could help her balance reduce by hypnosis, but she wouldn't like that what I did. She said she wanted to weigh 130 pounds and she didn't care what I did. I told her she'd find it rather painful. She said, I'll do anything you say. I said, all right, I want an absolute promise from you that you will follow my advice exactly. She gave me the promise very readily and I put her into a trance. I explained her again that she wouldn't like my method of reducing her weight and she promised me absolutely that she would follow my advice. She gave me that promise. Then I told her, let both your unconscious mind and your conscious mind listen. Here's the way you go about it. Your present weight is now 180 pounds. I want you to gain 20 pounds. And when you weigh 200 pounds on my scale, you may start reducing. She literally begged me on her knees to be released from her promise. And every ounce she gained, she became more and more insistent of being allowed to start reducing. She was markedly distressed when she weighed 190 pounds. When she was 190, she begged and implored to be released from her own promise. At 199, she said that she was close enough to 200 pounds, and I insisted on 200 pounds. When she reached 200 pounds, she was very happy she could begin to reduce. And when she got to 130, she said, I'm never going to gain again. Her pattern had been to reduce and gain. I reserved the pattern and made her gain and reduce. And she was very happy with the final thoughts and maintained that weight. She didn't want to ever again go through that horrible agony of gaining 20 pounds. For this patient, the gaining of 20 of weight is no longer either rebellion or an expression of something she wants to do. It has become something has coerced into doing. Therefore, just as she had previously resented having to lose weight, she now resents having to gain weight. In Sin, Erickson illustrated that sometimes it is necessary to help the patient to break the prohibition. Here he shows that it is often helpful to guide the patients to change their patterns. In this case, he simply had the woman reverse her pattern of reducing and gaining. Once she had done this, she could no longer go through the same sequence repeatedly as she had done all her life. She apparently had learned to be able to tolerate gaining weight only up to 180 pounds. We see this in many weight patients. They have a level of tolerance at which point they urgently feel the need to reduce. Erickson succeeded in making this tolerance level intolerable because he made her go beyond it. This method of reserving patterns or looking at things in a reserved way is one of Erickson's favorite approach of changing mental sets. He liked to show patients a book called Topsis and Turvis by Pete Neville, in which the stories and the illustrations change meaning when the book is turned upside down. A gorgeous way to diet. Now another girl was overweight and markedly so. I pointed out to her, "You are overweight and you've dieted and dieted to no avail. And you tell me that you can stay on a diet for a week or 2 weeks, even 3 weeks, and then you fall off and gorge. Then you are despairing and gorge some more. Now I'll give you a medical prescription. Continue the diet given to you by your doctor in the past. Stay on that diet for 2 weeks and 3 weeks if you can, and then on the last Sunday of the 3rd week, gorge like hell. Because it's medical orders. You can't gorge enough to offset your losses in the 3 weeks, and you can gorge without a sense of guilt, because you are under medical orders to gorge all Sunday. And the following Monday, go back to your diet. Stay on it 3 weeks if you can, and then have another guiltless gorge day." In my last letter from her, she says that there has to be a better way to diet than saving up her hunger 3 weeks. She wants to be hungry each day, wants to enjoy food and enjoy the proper amount each day. The gorging days gave her the strength to be on the diet for those 3 weeks. This approach falls into the category of prescribing the symptom. Erickson told the patient to do exactly what she had been doing, dieting for 3 weeks when she was able, and then gorging. All the change was the length of time devoted to the gorging. If a pattern can be changed, even in some small way, there is the possibility for further change. As we have seen many times, this is one of Erickson's basic approaches in therapy, to initiate a small change. So, where are we here? Yeah, I think I'll make a cut here. Thank you for listening and practicing.